Hello and welcome to the third VuFind video on testing. Last time we talked about unit testing, and this time we're going to talk about integration testing, actually making sure that the whole system works when put together with the help of automated browser testing. And we're going to do automated browser testing with the help of Mink. Mink is a library produced to support the BHAT project. BHAT is a behavior-driven development testing framework that I personally don't use, but fortunately, they shared their low-level browser integration as a separate project that can be integrated with all kinds of testing. And so the VuFind project takes advantage of this to allow browser automation from within our PHP unit suite. Today, I'm going to walk through some of our Mink code and show you the process I use for writing new Mink tests. So perhaps you can help us increase our coverage by adding to our overall integration suite. So let's start with a quick tour of the code. If you go into the VuFind module of the code, under the test directory, there's an integration tests directory, and under there is a Mink subdirectory with a whole bunch of tests in it. Let's start by looking at basic test, which is one of our simpler test cases. And just like any other PHP unit test, you're going to see that this is just a class whose name ends in test, which includes a whole bunch of methods that begin with test. So the first test here is called test homepage, and this just checks that the word VuFind appears when we open the VuFind homepage in a web browser. So let's look at how this works. First of all, let me highlight the fact that basic test extends VuFind test integration Mink test case, which is a base class that includes a whole bunch of VuFind specific helper methods wrapped around Mink code, which make common tasks a little bit more convenient. It helps make the tests less verbose and saves you some time coding. So we'll look at that in a little more detail later, but first let's get into this test. So first of all, there's this called a get Mink session, and this sets up Mink and gives us a session object, which is what allows us to control the browser that we're using for testing. The session object has a visit method, which we can send a URL to in order to navigate to a particular page. So again, this is taking advantage of another helper method in the base class called getVuFindURL, which gives us the base URL of the current running test environment, and then just goes to the search home route under that base URL. Once the session has visited a page, we can call the getPage method to get hold of a page object, which represents the content of the page. And from there, we can then make assertions about that content and interact with the page in other ways. So as I mentioned, this first test is really simple. We're just getting all the content of the page and asserting that somewhere in that content is the word VuFind. Very simple test. So let's look at a slightly more complex one. This is test Ajax status. And what this does is test that the Ajax routines that fill in item availability are working correctly. And it does this by just navigating to search results and then checking that expected values are present. So let's step through this. Starts off exactly the same as the last test. We get the Mink session, we go to the home page, we grab the page object so we can interact. But now we do a little bit more. First of all, we call find CSS, which is another helper method from the base class. What this does is it takes a page object that we want to search. And actually, it doesn't have to be a page object. It could be any page element. It searches within that element for a CSS selector. In this case, we're looking for the search input box by its ID, search form _ look for. And then if the selector cannot be found, it will throw an exception. Otherwise, it's going to return a reference to an object matching that selector. So in this case, we get back the search box object. And then on that object, we call set value, which allows us to actually interact with the page and fill in that text box with a search query. In this case, we're just retrieving one of the specific test records that were indexed as part of the setup of the test environment. Then we use another helper method from the base class, click CSS, which actually just calls find CSS and then clicks on the thing that it finds. So in this case, we're grabbing the primary button on the page, which in this instance should be the submit button for the search form, and we're clicking it. We then call another helper method. This one's called snooze. And all this does is wait for a second. Because browser-based testing is kind of timing dependent, a lot of these tests have to pause now and then to make sure that the browser has time to do all of the things that we want it to do. In this case, clicking the button is going to cause the next page to load. And then on the next page, it needs to make the Ajax call and fill in some details. We just want to be sure that all has happened before we make any assertions about what's going on. So again, after the snooze, we finish up our test with some assertions. By default, VuFind is set up with a sample driver, which always returns this call number of A123456 and a location of third floor main library. So we just want to make sure that those values appear in the places where we expect them to. So since we did a search for a single record, we can be confident that there's only going to be one call number and one location element on the resulting screen. So we just use find CSS to retrieve those elements and get text to pull out their content as plain text, make assertions about it, and we've tested that Ajax works, because if the Ajax call failed, these values that are loaded through the ILS driver call wouldn't be there. And there are a few more tests here. I'm not going to go through all of them in great detail, but they use the same basic elements as before. So you can read them on your own time if you want to learn a little bit more. Having sort of introduced what these test classes look like, I also wanted to talk about some shared characteristics of all of these tests. They're all designed in a way where tests early in the suite can potentially impact tests later in the suite. So, for example, there are a lot of tests where the first test will create a user account, and then subsequent tests will log into that account and make use of it. And that's okay. That's something that we do by convention in our test suites. It's useful to be able to test a number of things that depend on one another. However, every test class is designed to stand alone. So if a test creates data in the database, like user accounts, it is also designed to get rid of all of that data when it finishes running. That way, it's possible to run any of these test classes in isolation if you want to test a particular feature without having to worry that it has some kind of a dependency on some other test. It keeps things simple and isolated. So those are the two design principles to keep in mind. It's okay to have side effects within a test, in a test class, but it is not okay for test classes to interact with each other because they should all stand alone. And many of these tests actually check and make sure that they're being run in a clean, empty environment and will fail if they find, say, existing user data in the database. That just helps keep things predictable. So now that we've looked at an existing test class, and we've talked about some general principles, let's go ahead and look at that base Mink test case class just to see what that looks like. That's in the VuFind module source directory under VuFind test, integration, Mink test case. And as you can see, this is an abstract class. It's only meant to be extended when we build specific tests. And it builds upon the standard PHP unit framework test case. It also uses a couple of feature traits that may also be shared by other tests. The auto retry trait, which allows it to look for retry annotations in your test comments. And if it finds a numeric retry trait, or rather annotation, it will retry tests that fail a few times. And this is useful for the Mink test because, as I mentioned, sometimes because they're so timing dependent, something like a network hiccup will cause a test to randomly fail. But if you just try it over, it will succeed. So the auto retry trait prevents arbitrary circumstances from making your test suite fail. Also used here is the live detection trait. And this detects whether you've used Thing to set up a test environment. If there's no test environment active, we can't run Mink tests. We need to be able to detect that and fail the tests immediately if there's no environment to test with. And I'm not going to go through all the contents of this file. I just want to highlight a few useful helpers, many of which I already showed you when I went through the basic test. Here's one that's great. Change configs will take an array of configuration settings that we want to change and actually rewrite the ini files in the test environment for the duration of the test. This way, if you want to test a feature that's not turned on by default, you can change the configuration dynamically and test the feature. And this is designed in such a way that at the end of each test, all the configurations you changed will revert back to their default versions. So this automatically lets you test things within the context of a single test and not have to worry about later side effects. And this is used in quite a few places. Here is the snooze method I mentioned that just waits for a certain period of time. You'll notice that there's an environment variable here called VuFind snooze multiplier. By default, snooze is just going to wait 1 second, but you can set this environment variable to change the amount of time it waits for. So you could use a fractional value if you want to make it faster, if you're confident that your environment is just going to respond immediately, or you can make it a larger number if you're working in a resource-constrained environment and you want to slow down the tests to be completely sure that they pass. And then, there are many things here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you might want to review this on your own time just to see if there's anything here that might help you. Here's the find CSS method I mentioned that waits to see if things exist and then selects them and will fail if the selector fails to match anything. Click CSS and so forth. There's a lot of useful stuff in here. It saves you some time to extend this class instead of reinventing the wheel. The other thing is at the beginning of this, I showed you that we leverage a couple of feature traits that VuFind provides, but these two are not the only ones. If you look in the feature directory inside the VuFind test namespace, you'll see that we have quite a few traits that you can mix into your tests that will give you useful common functionality that might save you some time. Of particular interest for Mink testing are the live database trait, which gives you access to the real MySQL database if you want to create or destroy data. And the live, not the live detection trait, the user creation trait, which allows you to quickly create users by filling in the create account form and log in with them. So if you have a test that requires you to create users and log in and out, this trait just does those things for you so you don't have to reinvent that code. So obviously, this is no replacement for a Mink tutorial, but hopefully it shows you that if you look at the existing tests and these traits in base class, you can get a feel for how the testing works, and you should be able to make some tests of your own. So for now, let me show you the process I go through to write a new test. VuFind recently had a new feature added where public lists now show an icon to indicate that they're public and also display a message on some screens just to make it more obvious to users which of their lists are public and which are private. We don't currently have any test coverage for this new feature, so I'm going to work through writing that test just to show you how you can approach this. So first of all, I know that there's an existing test suite that applies to this kind of functionality, the favorites test, which has all kinds of tests related to favorites and favorite lists. And this, as I said, we can have tests where the tests all build upon each other. So this already creates some lists and populates them. It even makes one of them public. So what I think makes the most sense is to just add a test to this existing test suite, which checks that once we have public and private lists in place, they display the way we expect them to. So if I just search the code for public list, I find a comment here that there's a test called test email public list. And if I look through this code, I can see that one of the things that it's doing is making a list public. So what I think I want to do is just add another test following this one that will test that the icon appears where I expect it to, etc. Also note that this test has some dependencies documented through the depends annotation, which is how we show when one of our tests relies on side effects of an earlier test. So before I can actually start writing the code of my test, it makes sense for me to do a little bit of reconnaissance and collect some relevant information that I'm going to need while I do my test building. So the easiest way to do that is to just log into my test instance of VuFind and play around a little bit. Before I started recording this video, I already ran the startup task, so I have a running test instance here in localhost VuFind_test. So the quickest way to find out what I need is I'm just going to create an account. And I'm going to do a blank search. And I'm just going to create a couple of lists. I'll call one open, which will be my public list. And I'll call one closed, which will be my private list. And so now I'm just going to go into my account screen here. And you can see this is exactly what I'm looking to test. My public list has an icon next to it. My private list does not. So I just need to collect a little bit of information about what I am testing for. So I open up my handy browser console by hitting F12. And I'm just going to use my element inspector tool to take a look at what exactly is going on here. So I can see that all of my lists here have a class of user list link on them, which is going to be a useful selector for extracting information from the page object in my test. And if I open up this second link, the open one, I can see that it has an icon, which is an eye with the class of FA globe on it. So I take note of these two things, and this is going to help me when I write my test. And also, if I click on these lists, if I go to the public list, I see that it says public list right here up at the top. I'm going to inspect that as well. And so this is just a strong element with the FA globe icon inside it. So again, that's a distinctive selector that I should be able to test for. And I can see that if I click over to my private list, that public indicator is not present at the top. So I think this little investigation gives me a strategy. all I need to do to test that this is working the way I want it to is to go to the user account screen, look at the list of lists, check that the public ones have the public icon, the private ones do not. And then I can click into a public list, make sure that it shows that public message, and also click into a private list and verify that it does not have the public message. I think that covers all of our needs here. So now I just need to write that as code. However, during the course of this testing, I've created some data in the database, and that's going to prevent my tests from running because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the tests want to verify that they have a clean and empty environment before they run. So I am very quickly going to clean up after myself. I'm just going to go to the command line and log into my VuFind test database. And I can just run delete from user. That wipes out my account and all associated data. Now I'm all set to run my test once I have written it. But of course, now the hard part is actually writing the test. So obviously, I'm not going to do all of this development live while I'm recording a video. I did some of this work in advance. So I am just going to type out the code and explain it as I go. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about how I approached this. First of all, it can be a little frustrating to add a test to a long and complicated test suite like this one, because it takes 3 to 5 minutes to run. So every time you write your code and you want to test it, you have to sit through the whole test running, except that you don't actually have to sit through the whole thing. As I noticed here, the test that my test is going to depend upon only depends on 2 other specific tests, and they in turn may have some dependencies. But there are also a number of tests here that are irrelevant to what I'm doing. I find it's sometimes helpful during testing to just put a Z in front of the function name of all of the tests that I don't want to run, because PHP unit will only run methods that start with test. So this effectively disables them. So when I'm developing, I'll actually Z out almost all of my tests and then just re-enable the ones that I need to get to where I need to be. It saves a lot of time while you're iterating through. There are also some more formal ways that you can do this within the PHP unit framework. There is a filter option you can send to PHP unit that will allow you to run just one specific method, but that's not helpful if your method has dependencies on others. There's also a group option where you can add a group annotation like my group to particular tests. And then when you run PHP unit, you can specify -- group and a group name, and it will only run tests in that group. So there are a variety of ways you can control which tests you run when you're iterating through your test writing. But I tend to just do the manual Z out the unwanted tests approach. In any case, let me show you what I came up with after I went through that whole process. So since my test relies on data that was set up by test email public list and some of the earlier methods, I'm just going to write it immediately after that test. You'll notice that the next test is called test bulk delete, and it actually deletes some of the data that I'm going to be working with. So the order of the tests is very important in this example. So I always start my test with a comment explaining what the test does. So in this case, test that public list indicator appears as expected. And I'm going to state my dependencies here. So this depends on test email public list, as I already mentioned. It also depends on test add record to favorites login, which is another earlier test that creates some lists. And I learned as I was testing that I would need that. Now I'm going to actually create my test function. We'll call it test public list indicator. Might as well be nice and specific. Can also be fancy and give it a void return value annotation since it does not return anything. And so I'm actually going to start this by using a helper method that's defined earlier in this class. This go to user account. So this simply logs in as a user and goes to the account screen. The function is defined up above. I'm not going to review it now in the interest of time, but just take my word for it that this is going to save us the effort of writing all the code to get to the screen where we want to start doing our testing. And it just returns this helpful page object, which gives us access to the contents of the user account screen. Now I'm going to write a comment explaining what I'm going to do. Collect data about the user list links on the page. We are checking for expected descriptions and icons, and we'll want URLs so we can visit links individually. In other words, what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to extract all of the user list link elements from the page. So first of all, note that I am using page find all, which is actually part of Mink. So I just want to find all elements within the page that we got by accessing the user account. The first parameter here tells what kind of method I'm using to find elements. I'm using a CSS selector. You could also do things like search by the text within the element or other things, but CSS selectors are commonly the most useful thing. And then I'm just grabbing user list link, which is the CSS selector I came up with earlier when I was examining the page. So this is going to give me an array of all of the links on the page. And I'm just going to collect some information out of those links so that I can make assertions about it later. So I'm going to initialize a couple of arrays, a data array, which will describe all the links I find, and an hrefs array, which will collect all the links because we're going to want to go to some of these individual pages and check them for the public message. So now I iterate through all my links using a for each loop, and I just pull out the data I want. So each element of my data array is going to be another array, which has two elements. I'm going to pull the text out of the link. So I can just use link get text, which is another Mink method. It just returns the textual content of an element. And I'm going to get a count of how many icons are inside the link. So I'm just going to do count link find all. Again, I'm going to use a CSS selector, i.fa_globe. So this is the other thing that I figured out while I was inspecting the page earlier. So as you can see, the way Mink works is every element is searchable and can return more elements. So I got my page at the beginning. On the page, I found all my links. Each one of these links is an element which has the same interface as the page itself, so I can search within them. So I'm just looping through all my links, getting their text, and then searching all of them for icons and counting how many I find. So this is going to give me a handy array that summarizes all of my links. What's their text? How many icons do they have? And while I'm in here, I'm also going to add the href target of each of these links to my array. So I can do that by just saying link get attribute href. And again, get attribute is just part of the Mink framework, makes it easy to pull attribute values out of elements. So now, what do I expect? I'm going to create an expected data array, which I'm going to use in my assertion. And this is just what I expect I should have. And I learned these values by running the test and seeing what is done. I'm sparing you watching me do that. So I'm not getting these values by magic. I got these by actually running the test and seeing what the other tests created But the important thing is that the previous tests have created three lists. Two of them are private and one of them is public. So the result I expect from all of my work above is that I have an array with these three named lists. The first two have no icons. The third one, which is public and even has public list in its textual description, has one icon. So now all I need to do is make an assertion that this is the case. Assert equals expected data, data. So this just says the result of this loop should be exactly this stuff. And now the last thing to do is to check those two list pages for the presence or absence of the icon. So first of all, the future list should not be public. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the link to this list. The way I'm doing this is with a fancy CSS selector. So as I mentioned, I created this array of URLs up here as I loop through the links. I know that the future list is the first one because it's the first one in my list of expected data here. And I know that this is a private list because my icon count is 0. So I just take the first URL and I use that to select the link that has that as an href and click on it. Then, because it might take a moment to process, I'm going to snooze. And then I'm going to assert that there are no strong elements with globe icons in them on this page. So page, find all, CSS, strong i.fa globe. So this just searches the page for strong elements with globes in them, counts them, asserts that there aren't any. And finally, I'm going to copy and paste this code because I only need to change it slightly from my last test. The test list should be public. So fortunately, because this menu of lists is on every single page, I can be confident that this selector is going to work even though we've moved to a new page. I just want to click now on the third list instead of the first list, and indexing starts at 0, so that's hrefs 2. And I want to assert that there is going to be exactly one globe here rather than 0. And that's my test. So now all that's left to do is run it and make sure that it passes. So I'm going to go to the terminal and I'm going to use the Chrome test mode script that I created in our first testing video to start up an instance of Chrome that I can actually watch running while the tests run. So there, that's ready to go. I'm going to source my test environment script to make sure all of my variables are correct because I'm going to use VuFind home now. And so now I just run thing.sh, PHP unit faster. If anything fails, I want it to stop immediately. And I'm going to use the -d PHP unit extra param switch to tell PHP unit exactly which test to run, which in this case is going to be VuFind home module, VuFind tests, integration tests, source, VuFind test, Mink, favorites test. So this will run just the test I've modified. We'll have to wait a moment because it's going to run the whole suite, which includes all of the existing tests as well as the one I've just added. This is why I mentioned earlier when I was developing the test, I disabled a number of these to save some time. But as you can see, we've created an account. We're starting to build some lists and test other features of them. So now I'll just sit back and watch as the magic happens. Now we've created, I believe, all 3 of the lists that are going to get tested. Just doing some things within the various lists. Now we're creating a second user account because some of the tests check that user 2 can access public lists from user 1, but not private lists, and so forth. We can do some fast forwarding during the video editing over this portion. Here we're making a list public, so our test is coming up very soon. We just have to get through this emailing test. All right, I believe this is it. So we're logging in. We're switching between lists. And I think we're done. It went by very quickly, but it appears that all of the new tests have passed. So we just have to wait for the remaining tests to finish up, and we're done. All tests have passed. We have successfully written a new integration test. I realize this was a whirlwind tour and there's a lot more you could learn, but I hope this has been a helpful introduction, and I'd love to see some new tests contributed, especially if you plan on adding new functionality. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I'll have more content soon. Talk to you later.